Hello, my beautiful lost souls. As always, if you do not want to hear me blabbering in the darkness and you want to go straight to the story, I left the timestamp in the pinned comment. Tonight, I want to bring you a writer that most people still do not know, and that is a shame, Stefan Grabiński. You will often hear him called the Polish Lovecraft or the Polish Edgar Allan Poe. I understand why people use those names. They are easy comparisons. But honestly, when I read Grabiński, the writer he reminds me of most is Arthur Machen. There is something in his writing that moves between the mind and the unknown. His horror is psychological, but at the same time it feels metaphysical, as if madness and the supernatural were two sides of the same coin. Still, the truth is that Grabiński is not just the Polish version of anyone. He has his own voice. And what a strange voice it is. He does not need ruined castles or ancient temples to find horror. He finds it in the modern world, in train stations, in signals, in steel, in movement. With him, the machine is never only a machine. It breathes. It waits. Sometimes it seems to know more than the people inside it. I really want to bring more of his work to this channel, because our pursuit of the unknown should not stop with the names everyone already knows. Sometimes the best discoveries are waiting in the fog, on an empty platform, beside a train you are suddenly not sure you should board. And tonight's story is one of my favorites from him. A tired conductor, near the end of a long journey, sees something moving through the carriage. A naked figure, black with soot, wet with sweat, walking barefoot through the train. He knows that figure because he has seen it before, and every time it appears, disaster follows. But the most disturbing question is this: does the monster come to warn people of catastrophe, or does belief in the monster make catastrophe inevitable? So settle in, lost souls, the train is already moving. Tonight's story is SMOLUCH by Stefan Grabiński. Senior conductor Błażej Boron, having made his round through the carriages entrusted to his care, returned to the little corner reserved for his exclusive use, the so-called conductor's seat. Worn out by a whole day's tramping through the cars, hoarse from calling out stations in that autumn season swollen with fog, he meant to rest for a while on the narrow chair upholstered in oilcloth. A well-earned siesta smiled upon him. The day's turn was practically over. The train had already passed through the zone of closely spaced stops and was now heading at a long trot toward the terminal station. Until the end of the journey, Boron would no longer have to spring up from his bench and run down the steps for a few minutes to announce to the world, in his rasped voice, that this or that station had been reached, that the train would stop for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or a whole long quarter of an hour, or that it was time to change trains. He extinguished the lantern, fastened to his breast, set it high above his head on the shelf, took off his greatcoat, and hung it on a peg. 24 hours of uninterrupted service had filled his time so completely that he had hardly eaten a thing. His body now demanded its rights. Boron took some provisions from his bag and began to feed himself. The conductor's grey, faded eyes fixed themselves motionlessly on the carriage window and stared out into the world beyond the glass. The pane trembled with the jolts of the car, always equally smooth and black. He could see nothing through it. He tore his eyes away from the monotony of the frame and turned them down the corridor. His glance slipped along the line of doors leading into the compartments, crossed to the wall of windows opposite, and died away on the dull stretch of the floor. He finished his supper and lit his little pipe. True, he was on duty, but along this stretch, especially so close to the end, he had no fear of the inspector. The tobacco was good, smuggled across the border, and it smouldered in round, fragrant twists. Flexible ribbons unwound from the conductor's mouth, curled into little balls, and rolled like billiard balls along the passageway of the carriage. Then thick, compact coils came out, slowly drew out their blue stems, and burst against the ceiling in a petard of smoke. Boron was a master of pipe smoking. From inside the compartments came a wave of laughter. The guests were in good spirits. The conductor clenched his teeth in anger. Words of contempt fell from his mouth. Commercial travellers, the peddling breed. Boron, on principle, hated passengers. Their practicality irritated him. For him, the railway existed for the sake of the railway, not for the sake of travellers. The purpose of the railway was not to carry people from place to place for reasons of communication, but movement as such, the conquest of space. What could the railway care for the petty business of earthly pygmies, the industrial schemes of cheats, the filthy bargaining of traders? Stations did not exist so that people might get off at them, but so that they might measure the distance travelled. Railway stops were the test of the journey. Their successive changes, like in a kaleidoscope, were proof of the progress of motion. And so the conductor always looked with contempt upon the crowds pressing through the doors of the carriages onto the platform and back again. With an ironic grimace he observed breathless women and gentlemen, feverish with haste, rushing headlong amid shouts, curses, and sometimes shoves into the compartments in order to take a seat and get ahead of their fellows in the sheep-like herd. "Cattle!" he would spit through his teeth. As if God knows what in this world depended on some Mr. B or some Mrs. W arriving on time from F to Z. Meanwhile, reality stood in glaring contrast to Boron's views. People kept getting on and off at stations, kept crowding in with the same zeal, always with the same practical intentions. But the conductor took his revenge for it at every opportunity. In his district, which included 3 or 4 carriages, there was never any overcrowding, never that hideous suffocating crush of the rabble which sometimes robbed his colleagues of the will to live and formed a dark stain on the horizon of the grey conductor's lot. What methods he used, what roads he took to achieve this ideal unattainable for the other men of his profession, no one knew. The fact remained that even during the greatest rush of the holiday season, the interiors of Boron's carriages preserved a normal appearance. The passages were clear. In the corridors one breathed tolerable air. The conductor did not recognize extra seats or standing places. Strict with himself and exacting in service, he also knew how to be merciless toward travellers. He observed the regulations literally, sometimes with draconian cruelty. Tricks did not help, nor sly bargaining, nor the skillful sliding of bribes into his hand. Boron could not be bought. He had even reported several people for such attempts. He had slapped one fellow's face for insulting him, and had come out justified before the authorities. More than once it happened that in the middle of the journey, somewhere at some miserable halt, some wretched little station, or in the open fields, he politely but firmly requested a cheating guest to leave the carriage. Only twice in the course of his long career had he encountered worthy passengers who in some measure corresponded to his ideal of travellers. One of these rare specimens was a nameless tramp who, without a cent to his soul, boarded a first-class compartment. When Boron demanded his ticket, the ragged fellow explained to him that he did not need one, because he was travelling without any definite destination, just like that, into space, for pleasure, from an innate need for motion. The conductor not only acknowledged the justice of his reasoning, but throughout the whole journey carefully watched over the comfort of his guest and admitted no one into his compartment. He even shared half his provisions with him and smoked a little pipe in his company during a friendly conversation on the subject of travelling at random. The second passenger of that sort had happened to him a few years earlier on the stretch between Vienna and Trieste. He was a certain Saigon, allegedly a landowner from the Kingdom of Poland. This sympathetic man, surely well off besides, had also entered a first-class compartment without a ticket. Asked where he was going, he replied that, In truth, he himself did not know where he had got on, where he was heading, or why. "In that case," observed Boron, "perhaps it would be best to get off at the next station." "Oh no," replied the incomparable passenger. "I cannot. By God, I cannot. I must go forward. Something is driving me. Issue me a ticket wherever you please." The answer enchanted him to such a degree that he allowed the man to ride free of charge all the way to the final station, and did not trouble him again even once. That Saigon was said to have been regarded as a madman, but in Boron's opinion, if he was mad at all, then he was mad in the grand style. Yes, yes, there still existed, somewhere in the wide world, perfect travellers, but what were a few pearls in a sea of riffraff? The conductor often returned longingly to those two splendid events of his life, caressing his soul with memories of exceptional moments. He tipped his head back and watched the movements of the blue-grey streaks of smoke hanging in layers along the corridor. Above the rhythmic clatter of the rails, the whisper of hot steam driven through the pipes slowly emerged. He heard the gurgling of water in the tanks. He felt its warm pressure against the edges of the vessels. The objects were being heated, for the evening was cold. For an instant the lamps overhead narrowed their lashes of light and went out. But not for long, because in the very next moment the zealous regulator automatically injected a fresh dose of gas which fed the weakening burners. The conductor sensed its peculiar, heavy smell, somewhat reminiscent of fennel. The smell was stronger than the smoke of his little pipe, more seductive, and it confused the senses. Suddenly Boron thought he heard the tread of bare feet on the floor of the corridor. Thud, 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 the naked feet thudded. Thud, thud, thud. The conductor already knew what it meant. It was not the first time he had heard those steps on a train. He leaned out his head and looked down the dark perspective of the car. There, at the end, where the wall bent and receded toward the first-class compartment, he saw for 1 second the creature's back, naked as usual. Only for 1 second did its spine flash before him, arched like a bow and drenched in streaming sweat. Boron trembled. SMOLUCH had appeared in the train again. He had first noticed him 20 years before. It was an hour before the terrible disaster between Znix and Saint-Gégage, in which more than 40 people perished, not counting the great number of wounded. The conductor was 30 then, and still had strong nerves. He remembered the details exactly, even the number of the doomed train. He had been in charge of the rear carriages then, and perhaps for that reason he survived. Proud of his newly won promotion, he was taking home, in one of the compartments, his fiancée, his poor Kasienka, one of the victims of the catastrophe. He remembered how, while speaking with her, he had suddenly felt a strange uneasiness. Something dragged him violently toward the corridor. Unable to resist, he went out. Then, at the mouth of the carriage vestibule, he saw the disappearing figure of a naked giant. Its body, blackened with soot and dripping with dirty coal sweat, gave off a suffocating odor. In it were the smell of fennel, the reek of smoke, and the stench of grease. Boron rushed after him and wanted to seize him, but the apparition dissolved before his eyes. For some time he heard only the tramping of bare feet on the floor. Thud, 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 thud. About an hour later the train collided with an express coming from Saint-Gégage. Since that time SMOLUCH had appeared to him twice more, each time as an announcement of disaster. The second time he saw him a few minutes before the derailment near Rawa. SMOLUCH was then running along the board on the roofs of the carriages and signalling to him with a fireman's cap, which he had torn from his sweating head. He looked less threatening than he had the first time. And so, somehow, there were no serious casualties. Apart from a few lightly wounded, no one died. 5 years earlier, while travelling on a passenger train to Bonzek, Boron had glimpsed him between two cars of a passing freight train, which was coming from the opposite direction toward Wierzyniec. SMOLUCH was squatting on the buffers and playing with the chains. The colleagues to whom he pointed this out laughed at him and called him a lunatic. But the near future proved him right. That very night, the freight train, crossing a bridge undermined by water, plunged into the abyss. SMOLUCH's prophecies were infallible. Wherever he appeared, an inevitable catastrophe threatened. Threefold experience had strengthened Boron in this conviction, had shaped the railwayman's deep faith in the ominous apparition. The conductor felt toward him both the idolatrous reverence of a professional and the fear one feels before an evil and dangerous deity. He surrounded his apparition with a special cult and formed for himself an original view of its nature. SMOLUCH dwelt inside the organism of the train. He saturated its many-jointed skeleton, beat invisibly in its pistons, sweated in the boiler of the locomotive, wandered through the carriages. Boron felt his nearness all around him, a constant, continuous presence, though not a visible one. SMOLUCH slept in the soul of the train. He was its secret potential, which, in moments of danger, at the instant of evil premonitions, separated itself, condensed, and assumed a body. To oppose him seemed to the conductor unnecessary, even ridiculous. Any possible effort to prevent the misfortune he announced would be vain, obviously without effect. SMOLUCH was like destiny. The renewed appearance of the monster in the train, and so shortly before the end, threw Boron into a state of powerful excitement. At any moment, some catastrophe might be expected. He rose and began pacing nervously up and down the corridor. From inside one of the compartments there came a murmur of voices, the laughter of women. He approached and for a few seconds looked inside. He extinguished their merriment. Someone slid open the door of the neighboring compartment and put his head out. "Conductor, are we far from the station?" "In half an hour we shall be at our destination. We are reaching the end." There was something in the intonation of the answer that struck the questioner. His eyes rested for a long moment on the conductor. Boron smiled mysteriously and passed on. The head withdrew into the interior. A man came out of a second-class compartment and, opening a window in the corridor, looked out into space. His violent movements betrayed a kind of uneasiness. He raised the window and went away in the opposite direction, to the end of the passage. There he took a few draws on a cigarette and, throwing away the chewed mouthpiece of the stub, stepped out onto the platform of the car. Through the glass, Boron saw his silhouette bending over the safety bar in the direction of travel. "He is examining space," he muttered, smiling maliciously. "Nothing will help. Mischief does not sleep." Meanwhile, the nervous passenger returned to the carriage. "Has our train already crossed the express from Gron?" he asked with forced calm, noticing the conductor. "Not yet. We expect it at any moment. Besides, it may be that we pass it at the terminal station. A delay is not impossible. The express you have in mind is coming from the branch line." At that moment a violent roar sounded from the right. Beyond the window there flashed a gigantic outline breathing a broom of sparks, and after it, in the flight of thought, there swept by a chain of black boxes lit by rectangular cutouts. Boron stretched out his hand toward the train that was already vanishing. There it is. With a sigh of relief, the uneasy gentleman drew out his cigarette case and offered it to the conductor. "Let us smoke, conductor. Real Moeris cigarettes." Boron touched his hand to the peak of his cap. "Thank you kindly. I smoke only a pipe." "A pity. They are good." The traveller lit a cigarette himself and returned to his compartment. The conductor smiled mockingly after him. "He sensed something, only he calmed down too soon. Do not shout victory yet. Brother, you have not leapt the fence." And yet the successful crossing troubled him a little. The chances of an accident had decreased by one. It was already 9:45. In 15 minutes they were to stand at Gron, at the end of the journey. Along the way there was no longer any bridge that might collapse. The only train from the opposite direction with which a collision could possibly occur had been passed successfully. one should probably expect a derailment, then, or some catastrophe at the station itself. In any case, SMOLUCH's forecast had to come true. He guaranteed it. He, senior conductor Boron. This was not about people, nor about the train, nor about the integrity of his own little person, but about the infallibility of the barefoot monster. Boron cared enormously about preserving SMOLUCH's authority before the skeptical conductors, about maintaining his prestige in the eyes of unbelievers. The colleagues to whom he had several times told the story of the mysterious visits took the matter humorously, explaining the whole business as a hallucination, or worse, as the result of a soaked head. This last supposition hurt him especially, since he never drank. Several considered Boron a superstitious crank and a madman. Thus his honor, and in a certain sense his sound human reason, were at stake. He would rather break his own neck than live through SMOLUCH's failure. It was 10 minutes to 10. He finished his pipe and climbed the little steps to the top of the car into the glassed-in booth on all sides. From there, from the height of the crow's nest, by day the whole space lay open in the palm of the hand. Now the world was steeped in thick darkness. Patches of light fell away from the windows of the carriages, inspecting the slopes of the embankment with yellow eyes. Before him, 5 carriages away, the engine scattered bloody cascades of sparks. The chimney breathed white-pink smoke. At the last moment they realized it, almost at the very last instant, some 500 meters before the station. So SMOLUCH lied? Suddenly he understood his role. He quickly approached the blockman, who, having fitted the handle, was throwing the switch stand and changing the color of the signal to green. At all costs, this man had to be drawn away from the switch and forced to abandon his post. Meanwhile, his colleagues were already giving the signs to depart. From the end of the train, the command was already being passed from mouth to mouth. "Go!" "Wait! Hold there!" cried Boron. "Switchman!" he said in a low voice to the official standing rigidly in service posture. "There is some tramp visible there at your signal box." The blockman grew uneasy. He strained his sight in the direction of the little brick building. "Quickly!" Boron urged him on. "Move from here! He may start throwing the levers, damage the apparatus!" "Go! Go!" sounded the impatient voices of the conductors. "Wait, damn it!" Boron objected. The switchman, compelled by the force of the voice, by the peculiar power of the command, broke into a run toward the signal box. Then Boron, taking advantage of the moment, seized the handle of the switch stand and connected the rails back to track 1. The maneuver was performed skillfully, quickly, and quietly. No one noticed. "Go!" he cried, withdrawing into the shadow. The train started, making up for lost time. A moment later, the last carriage was sliding into the darkness of space, dragging behind it the long red trail of its lantern. After a moment, the bewildered switchman came running back from the signal box and carefully examined the position of the switch stand. Something displeased him. He raised the whistle to his mouth and gave 3 desperate signals, too late. For now, from the direction of the station, an awful crash shook the air, a dull, booming detonation, and then a hellish uproar, clamor and groans, lamentation, weeping, and howling tangled into one wild chaos with the clanking of chains, the cracking of shattered wheels, the thunder of carriages mercilessly crushed. "Collision," whispered whitened lips.